Mass shootings in 2019 are on track to surpass the total from 2018. The Gun Violence Archive counts more than 250 mass shootings so far this year in America. The group defines mass shootings as any incident where 4 or more people are shot, not including the gunman. Yesterday, President Trump proposed several ideas to curb gun violence. They include passing so-called red flag laws and addressing mental health. Kevin McAleenan, acting Secretary of Homeland Security, joins us for an interview you'll see only on CBS This Morning. He is in Washington. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Anthony. Thank you.
You have echoed the FBI director in saying that white supremacist extremist violence is an increasingly concerning threat. Is it now our top domestic terrorist threat?
Well, I think that's the information we have from the FBI over the last 2 years. The number of their investigations are racially motivated, and within that category, the majority are white supremacist extremists motivated.
So what is Homeland Security doing to prevent these kind of attacks?
So the Department of Homeland Security focuses on the prevention, preparedness, and creating response assets in communities that are ready to deal with these kind of events. Our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency does thousands of trainings a year, as well as our U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center. They've already reached 12,000 individuals, thousands of communities around the country, talking about those indicators that could prevent an attack from happening in the first place and making sure our communities are ready.
You're also providing active shooter training. That's your responsibility.
That's correct. That's back to the CISA team. They do active shooter training through their protective security advisors in cities all over the country continuously. And we're reaching a number of communities who are better prepared. And I think you see that in the effectiveness of the law enforcement response in a number of these incidents.
In April, you announced the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Protection. But the LA Times reported last night that you have about a quarter of the staff and an eighth of the budget that a similar program did in the Obama administration. Is that accurate?
So what we need to invest more, no question. In my first week as acting secretary, we stood up that office. I've asked Congress for an out-of-cycle budget request to help bolster it and increase our reach and capability. But it doesn't cover the level and scope of effort across the Department of Homeland Security enterprise. As I mentioned, both CISA, the U.S. Secret Service, our intelligence and analysis component, our outreach to the state and local communities is extensive and effective.
So how much more do you need?
Well, we do need a better effort to coordinate that at the headquarters level, and that's what I've directed. I'd like to triple the staff we have available to address this and coordinate the intelligence side of it at the headquarters level, as well as investing in those grants and efforts that are going to help communities prepare for these kind of incidents.
If this is our top domestic terrorist threat, why aren't we responding more aggressively?
Well, I think we are responding aggressively, and the president gave us a very clear call to action, tasked the Department of Justice with a number of different steps. The Department of Homeland Security will be engaged in supporting those efforts. I've also directed a surge of all of our training and preparedness assets on a risk basis to communities across the country based on what we know. There's another element of DHS, the Homeland Security Advisory Council. This brings in experts from around the country to help advise us. We already set up a task force earlier this spring on houses of worship and faith-based organizations because we've seen them be targets of white supremacist extremism too often. So we'll have our first event next week on those issues as well.
You're also head of Commissioner of Customs and Border Patrol. And I think you said you had something like 4,000 personnel in the El Paso area. So this hit home for you.
Very much so. We've got 4,000 families from DHS in the El Paso area. We did have members of our CBP team had family members affected. And we actually had one of our leaders, a port director, Donna Sifford, in the Walmart during the attack. She responded and provided life-saving assistance to one of the injured victims, and just tremendously proud of her and her response.
You probably heard, Mr. Secretary, that some of the Hispanic members of the community in El Paso have suggested that the president's rhetoric has contributed to the situation. Do you think the president's rhetoric in any way has inflamed this problem?
Well, a lot of those Hispanic members of the community are CBP employees. Our Border Patrol agents are a majority Hispanic, and those are our families. That's our community. And I think we do a great job protecting it at the border, but also responding to help state and locals address it in the interior.
But do you think rhetoric on a national scale by a figure of the president's stature contributes to the problem?
I think we've got a responsibility to call out hate in all of its forms, and white supremacist extremism is a critical element that we're trying to address. I think the president was very clear on that yesterday.
We also mentioned Jeff Pegues had a report earlier in our broadcast about the problem with the internet. Do you believe that we have to shut down some of these sites, or is it more efficient essentially to monitor them to be able to keep an eye on what's going on?
So I think that's a really important point, Anthony. The Secret Service Mass Attacks in Public Spaces report has identified that in almost all of these incidents, there's a threatening or concerning indicator from the individual attacker, and a lot of that occurs online. So we have to be more effective at monitoring these sites, not only as a federal government, but really as a whole of community effort. And I just want to tell your viewers, if you have a family member, a colleague, someone you're connected with who indicates issues of concern, please tell law enforcement, please tell someone about that, because in nearly all of these cases, there is an indicator before an attack happens. Both
suspects this past weekend used high-capacity weapons that they purchased legally. Do we need restrictions on these kind of weapons?
I think the president talked about this issue yesterday. He's asked the Department of Justice to look at legislation that could be necessary in these areas. But I think we've got to get better at addressing those early warning indicators, both as a federal family, but also with whole of community efforts across the country.
Acting Secretary Kevin McAleenan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.